Good afternoon. Welcome to September's webinar. The one this month is called Reactive Attachment Disorder. It may not be what you've heard. In order to receive credit for a webinar, you need to email your regional trainer, so whatever region you're in, the trainer, and that's Cliff Farnsworth for Southwest Region, Brian Young for Northern Region, Les Harris for Eastern Region, Terry Rowley for Western Region, and Liz Rivera for Salt Lake. Just email your regional trainer, let them know the date you listen to the webinar, so if you're listening live, then obviously today, or on archive if you listen at another date, and 3 things you have learned from the webinar, and then we'll give you the credit for the hour. You can do up to 4 hours per year for webinar credit for your in-service training. Of course, you can listen to as many webinars as you want to, but only 4 hours count towards your relicensing hours. So today's webinar, this is something that has been a kind of an in-house issue for a lot of years. I can't remember exactly how long ago, but probably I would say in the beginning of the foundation, so somewhere around maybe 1999 or 2000, probably around 2000, we had the opportunity to hear from a woman who, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the webinar, who had a very strong bent toward a certain way of looking at attachment. And when we went and listened to her, it was a 2-day event, and we went and listened to her, and she's widely renowned. Even today, she's still very famous in this field. But as we listened to her, we realized that there were some things that just didn't seem right. And that set us on a journey that's been going on, for the last, 14, 15 years, about really trying to understand attachment and trying to get good information out to families about attachment. Unfortunately, sometimes it feels like a little bit of we're swimming upstream. The really information about attachment that we consider to be really problematic, and I'll talk about that, is very prevalent and has a very strong hold. And it's kind of been loosened in the last few years for a variety of reasons, but it's still very strong. And so we are constantly trying to help to educate families and other folks about attachment and help them to kind of see it from a little bit different light. And that's kind of what we're going to try to do today, is in just this hour. Really, this is about a 30-year conversation, but to try to encapsulate that in this hour. We're going to start then. We're going to start a little further back than 30 years. We're going to start back to pre-World War II London. And during this time, there was a man by the name of John Bowlby, which we'll talk about more in just a minute, and who was studying for his PhD in London. And at the time, the accepted beliefs around children, especially young children, was they really didn't have much of an emotional life. And that attachment, and that word wasn't used then, but more maybe love or bonding, a relationship was more, was what they called secondary drive. So the primary drive, in our case, what we're going to talk about today is hunger. A baby's born with a massive primary drive. One of them is hunger. The mother meets the primary drive by feeding the baby, and that's the baby secondarily loves the mother because the mother meets the primary drive of hunger by feeding the baby. And this was kind of a Freudian thought. And there were a lot of other clinicians, Melanie Klein being one of them, who really latched onto this and really believed that food was one of the primary mechanisms. This is where all that oral fixation stuff comes from. And so John Bowlby comes along into this atmosphere. And he's actually a student of Melanie Klein, who's been a student of Freud's. And he's taught all this stuff and believes it because, what else does he know? And then he has his first practicum experience. So he's a young PhD student, and he's getting toward the end of his studies, and he has to go out into the real world, into the field, and have some real experiences. And he's actually assigned to a foundling home that's run by Anna Freud, who's Sigmund's daughter, who has a very different orientation of the world than her father. And as he's working with these children in this foundling home, so it's kind of an orphanage, although some of the children are not there permanently. It's some due to the war and the air raids and that kind of thing. But anyway, these are young children. As he's working with these children, he's saying that if Freud's prime or secondary drive theory is correct, then the children should readily take to and love the staff members who are feeding them. And that's not what happened. What happened was these children didn't love the people who were feeding them and actually continued to yearn for and grieve the parent that they had lost. So this really made him start to question the idea of the secondary drive theory. And he comes back, he continues his studies, the war ends. He's reading a lot about the orthologists, so Conrad Lorenz's work. He's the guy with the ducklings name printing, Nico Tinbergen, Darwin's work, which is becoming even more widely read and more influential. And he's starting to think there's something else going on here. And he also starts to work with latency age boys. So these are boys who are 9, 10, 11 years old that have been involved in the juvenile justice system there in London. And all these kids have been involved in some kind of thievery. And he starts working with these boys. And he said every single one of these boys had been neglected by their mothers. And a significant portion of them had also been abused by their mothers. And he said, according to secondary drive theory, if love and attachment is secondary to having primary needs met, he said then these children shouldn't love or be attached to their mother. And yet he said 201, every one of these boys were. In fact, his first published paper is called 47 Juvenile Thieves. And it's really him laying out the history of these boys, the maltreatment they experienced, and yet the persistent attachment to their mothers that continue. So all of this together leads him to articulate what today we know as attachment theory. Now, attachment theory, it's interesting because, like any theory, especially as it gets detached to some degree from its founder, gets convoluted a little bit. And some of it, we'll talk about this more too, but some of the information about attachment theory has been kind of mangled. And so I want to kind of get us back to the core of what Bowlby really was talking about and how we need to be, when we're talking about attachment, especially attachment theory, we need to be very careful. We're talking about a very discrete set of behaviors and needs. And one of the problems that's happened is that people have made it about too much. I always say attachment is a small golden basket. It's very, very important. It's vital to our well-being, but it's small. It's not about everything. It's about very specific things. Those things can touch other things, but we have to be really careful that we're not putting more in this basket than it can contain. I want to talk about a colleague of John Bowlby's. Let me up this slide again. So this is our discrete basket then. So we talk about what we're talking about. We're talking about attachment, the attachment system, attachment theory. This is where we need to keep coming back to, and this will be more clear to you in a few minutes. So the purpose of the attachment system, it's also important to realize that we have a lot of other behavioral systems as well that motivate us, that lead us to act in certain ways. And we'll talk about one of the conflations that some of the people who have not the best information about attachment give out, and that's really a conflation or a confusion of the attachment system and the dependency system. And we'll talk about those two things a little bit more. But the purpose of the attachment system, so a small golden basket, is to offer the child a feeling of felt security. Now, this word felt is vital. One thing that a lot of foster and adoptive families have an experience in is providing a truly safe environment for a child in their care, and yet that child's still not feeling safe. It's the subjective experience of the child, the felt security that is vital. And so one thing, especially as kids get older, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, is what makes that child feel safe. Not what we think makes him feel safe, but what actually makes him feel safe and how vital that is. And the safety of felt security in the face of fear, pain, or uncertainty, which is also known as life. And then also the other purpose of the attachment system, and this actually, Bowlby's work at first was really focused on this felt security and the hardwired, millions of years of evolution that we have developed this need to be close to someone, a consistent someone who will keep us safe. And that's kind of where he started. As his work progressed and as his theory has been taken by other really profound researchers, the system also has been found to offer the child an access to a mature regulatory system. So what this means then is, if any of you have ever been to Circle Security, and if you haven't, I would highly recommend it. It's a series that we offer probably 2 or 3 times a year, and sometimes we even go statewide with it. But this is the idea of the biggest sacrifice of kind caregiver. This is children are immature regulatory systems. Both they're unable to keep themselves safe, and they also are unable to regulate their intense emotional experiences. And thus they look to someone who is bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind to help them to understand, to cope with, to manage, to contain their own overwhelming emotional experience. And what the research on attachment, in fact, we'll get a little further into this, what the research on attachment in the last, I'd say, decade or two has really been focused on is this piece. So they know that the need for felt security is very important, and it absolutely is, especially with our kids. But that second layer, the need for someone to help me understand and contain my own emotional experience, is also vital to attachment. Now, Mary Dozer, whose work I will probably reference a little bit later on, she actually believes it's not just emotions, and Stephen Porges believes this too, that it's actually body temperature, heart rate, vagal tone, our entire bodily regulatory system, so not just our emotions, but everything that goes on for us bodily needs to be regulated, is actually regulated initially by that primary attachment figure. And that's why when you walk out of the room and your child acts like they're falling apart, they kind of are, literally, at a biological level. Your absence from them is more than they can take at times, because it's your presence that actually allows them to regulate their entire bodily system, literally from head to toe. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about attachment, these are the two things that I'm going to keep coming back to, are felt security and regulation. Those are our core pieces. Okay, this is where I'm going to talk about the colleague of John Bowlby. So Mary Ainsworth, so she was a student, and she heard about Bowlby's work, and she thought, this is the man I want to study with. So she moved from the United States to England to study with John Bowlby. And she became very enamored of this attachment theory, but she wanted to make it something that went beyond just kind of the theoretical, and she wanted to make it something that was measurable, observable, and measurable. And so she came up with what's called the strange situation, which is an opportunity to stress the child's attachment system, meaning their sense of safety and regulation, without being unethical, because we could do that in a way that was unethical, but enough to activate their attachment system without causing lasting harm to the children. So she came up with what's called the strange situation, and they started doing this in the 1950s, and it's still being done today. So, 60, 65 years later, this is still a standard procedure for measuring attachment security. Now, in young children, now this is important because as a kid gets older, and I've seen this used on children up to age 4 or 5, but most researchers would say probably 3 is the upper limit to be able to use this with, because a child has to be young enough still, their regulatory system still has to be immature enough that the immediate absence from the primary caregiver is distressing to them. For a child who's older, who has a history with a caregiver whose regulatory system is more mature, their ability to tolerate absence from their caregiver increases. So when you leave a 5-year-old in the room alone for a few minutes, they're not going to get nearly as upset as a 2-year-old would. So, there's difficulty in measuring attachment security as we get into older kids, because they're able to, they're more cognitive, and they're more able to manage things on their own a little bit. So that's been a real challenge in the field, although there are some measures that they use. It's still a challenge in the field to actually measure attachment security the same way in an older child as we would in a younger child. But let me tell you a little bit how they do this in young children. And usually, we're talking about young children, they have to be ambulatory. So usually they start this around 14, 16 months. And then, like I said, the upper limit for most researchers is 3, although I've seen it used up to ages 4 and 5. So they bring a child in a room. It's a kind of a waiting room. There's a couch, a couple chairs, maybe there's some magazines, and then there's a box full of toys. And think about an 18-month-old child. Mama comes in with a child. She sits down. Most children immediately are going to go over that box of toys and start to explore. Now, if you come to circle security, we talk about the flip side of the attachment system being the exploration system. So what we expect to see in most children is exploration at this point. They're comfortable, they feel safe, the caregiver is present and available, they explore. Then a stranger walks in the room, they watch what happens. Most kids are going to orient toward the caregiver, either physically move toward her or look at her. It also could be the dad, so it could be him. So they kind of watch that. Then the mom or dad gets up, walks out of the room, child alone with a stranger. Now, most children will protest their parents' absence, anything from something as simple as walking to the door, looking at the door, to crying. And most of them will not approach the stranger, and most of them actually will give warning signals to the stranger, stay away, kind of that glare that kids give. Mom walks back in. She's only gone for a few minutes. Then the stranger walks out. Then the mom walks out again. Now the child's alone. This all takes place within probably 10, 15 minutes. And most children by that second separation are very upset because there's been a lot of disruption to their sense of regulation and security. So mom comes back in after the second separation, and this is where the researchers say is the most telling moment, because this is where we say, does the child have the capacity to use the parent as a secure base to regulate themselves, calm themselves down, and then go back to exploration? So most kids, so in a non-clinical sample in the United States of America, it's somewhere around, the lowest I've seen is 55%, the highest I've seen is around 65%, so just over half to two-thirds. Non-clinical samples, these are not kids in foster care, these are just everyday families. Most of the kids, they go to the mom when she walks back in. They signal to her to pick them up. She picks them up. They calm down, and they go back to play. And that's what we see in most kids. Then there's, and I'm going to flip to this next slide because we're going to talk about the different categories. So as they started doing this, they started looking at the discrete differences in behaviors of the children, and they started classifying what the attachment security was. So the kids I just described, they go to mom picks them up, they calm down, they go back to exploration. These kids are considered secure. They get upset at their mother's absence or their caregiver's absence. They become regulated in her presence, and then they go back to exploration. That's what we expect to see in secure kids, and we see that in just over half to two-thirds of kids. The resistant kids, also known as some research as ambivalent, these kids look a lot like the secure kids in a variety of ways. They're upset at the mother's absence, but there's a couple of big differences. The first difference they see is these kids have a hard time with exploration. They want to play with the toys, but they're also really focused on what mom is doing. And so they look at mom and they try to keep her in their sight, and they're not as interested in playing as they are in keeping mom in sight. They get as upset or more upset than the secure kids. They try to use mom as a secure base when she comes back, meaning they go to her in distress, just like the secure kids do. But the key thing is they don't calm down. And not only do they not calm down when mom picks them up, but they send mixed signals. This is why they call them resistant or ambivalent, is because they'll stray arm mom, they'll arch their back, they'll try to hit mom. So they give signals that basically say, put me down, but if mom tries to put them down, they say, no, pick me up. So they know they need mom, but they're just not quite sure what to do with mom when they have her. They're upset with her for leaving them. They want to use her to calm down, but they can't. And they just continue to stay activated. And so these kids, we tend to think about them as staying on the activated side of the system. Now, this chart I have here on the screen right now, this is from Kim Bartholomew's work. And she's added in the idea of avoidance and anxiety for this, which is avoidance is how they act toward the caregiver, and anxiety is degree of anxiety. So in secure kids, you see low avoidance of the caregiver, and you also see low anxiety. So these kids use the caregiver to manage their anxiety. So they don't avoid the caregiver, and that then helps them to manage their anxiety. Resistant kids, they don't avoid their caregiver, but they aren't able to use her to manage their anxiety. Now, to come to triple security, we talk a little bit about what leads to this. And Mary Ainsworth's work also included what's called naturalistic observation. So she would actually just go into families' homes and observe them in caring for their children. Now, the Heisenberg principle that anything observed gets changed. So we understand that the very process of being observed. But she saw enough consistent differences across parenting and then the results in a strange situation that they feel like they can make some pretty good correlations between what they see in a strange situation and what they were seeing in the observations. So what they see with these parents is two things, two really obvious things. First is these caregivers tend to be really inconsistent. So sometimes they're really attuned to their child, and sometimes they're really clueless. And I'm not talking about just normal variants of our attunement, but really, really significant, so that the kid doesn't really know which caregiver they're going to get from one moment to the other. And that's one reason I think that these kids have a heightened attachment or anxiety, is because the kids have learned, if I really, really, really show you how much I need you, I'm more likely to get the response I need from you. But you're not really good at reading my cues, and so I'm going to have to really overplay my cue for you to get it. The other thing they see with these caregivers is these caregivers tend to be uncomfortable with the child's separation from them. So if you've ever known that parent who wants their kid or needs their kid to need them and actually create situations in which their child has to come back to them, this is one thing they see with those kids as well, or caregivers and kids as well. The avoidant kids, I didn't say this. The resistant or ambivalent, that's about a 10 to 15% in the non-clinical population. The avoidant kids, this population is about 25 to 30% of the non-clinical sample. So that's about a quarter to a third. And when they first started looking at these kids, they didn't know what they were looking at because it was nothing they predicted was happening. If kids are attached to their caregivers, they're going to get upset when their caregivers leave them, and they're going to use their caregivers as a secure base, or try to at least, when the caregiver comes back. These kids weren't doing that. These kids, when the caregiver left, they were fine. When the caregiver came back, they didn't care. When she left again, they didn't care. When the stranger came in, they didn't orient to mom. A lot of times these kids would go to the stranger. And so they start thinking, what's going on? That's a lot of kids to not be attached. Because at first that's what I thought. These are kids who weren't attached. And according to Bowlby's theory, what he really said is that if a caregiver provides enough care to keep a child alive, there's going to be some attachment there because it's an evolutionary, it's dictated by our hardwiring that's given to us by millions of years of evolution. So they couldn't understand what they were seeing. Well, then they got more sophisticated in their measures, and they started looking at heart rate. What was the other one? Heart rate, blood pressure, and cortisol level. And cortisol level they can test with just a swab of saliva, and it's a stress hormone. So you know what happened to all three of these measures: heart rate, blood pressure, and cortisol level. When Mama left the room, they all went up, and when Mama came back in the room, they went down. So this child's attached because they're becoming dysregulated at their caregiver's absence and regulated in their caregiver's presence. But on the outside, the kid is cool as a cucumber. They act like they could take the mom or leave the mom. This is very important when we start talking about attachment, especially kids with attachment issues. So many kids in foster care get labeled as attachment disordered when in fact they're avoidantly attached. This is very important. One thing I've seen happen, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is that people have labeled resistant or ambivalent, avoidant, and then disorganized. We'll talk about in a minute. They've labeled these as attachment disorders. These are not attachment disorders. These are variants of attachment in response to the kind of caregiver I have. And let me tell you why avoidant makes perfect sense and it's not pathological. These kids have been given a caregiver who doesn't like their distress. And this is what they find from the observation of these kids. Is this is the caregiver who says, quit your crying, I don't want to hear it, you're fine, knock it off, I'm not a human pacifier. This is the caregiver who rejects their child when their child's distressed. And so these kids learn by 11 months of age, they learn that in order to stay close to my caregiver, I have to tone down my need for the caregiver. And so these are the kids that learn that I don't cry, I don't act like I need them, I act like I don't need them. And by doing that, that keeps the caregiver close. It's incredibly adaptive because the whole point of this system is keeping the caregiver close. And so if I have a caregiver who doesn't like it when I cry, I'm going to quit crying because that's how I keep her close to me. It's not pathological. It's brilliant. Now, no 11-month-old child is working this out cognitively in their brain. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. Attachment's visceral. It's in our bones. It's in our sinews. It's in our blood. There's not a lot of thinking involved in attachment. This stuff gets laid down really early on. And it's all about how do I keep her close to me? How do I keep her here? Because the closer she is to me, the safer I am. And that's the safety piece being the first important piece. Now, what we do know is that second layer, that regulation layer, kids who are resistant or ambivalent and kids who are avoidant absolutely have problems around regulation. The kids who are avoidant we conceptualize as overregulated, and the kids who are resistant we conceptualize as underregulated. So there are regulation issues here, but remember, safety is the first consideration, and so we'll throw out regulation to get safety in this particular situation. Now, disorganized, and this is another, I think this is a really important category. They've seen this all along. So when they started doing the same situation in the 1950s, they saw this behavior, but they didn't know what to do with it. And so this would be a kid who, in all other respects, looked secure, resistant, or avoidant, but they have some strange behaviors in addition. So they do things like walk toward the caregiver backwards, or walk toward the caregiver and then fall down a few feet before they got to her, or fall asleep when they weren't obviously sleepy, which is a form of dissociation. They would cover their heads, like when the caregiver went to pick them up, they'd act as if they were afraid of the caregiver, but everything else looked like one of the other categories, so they didn't know what to do with these kids. And so they actually, in the 1980s, two professors from Berkeley University who worked with Mary Main, they said, we need to start looking at this a little bit more detailed. And that's when they came up with the disorganized classification. Now you'll see here, avoidant is considered low anxiety, high avoidance. So they avoid a caregiver, and that's in order to manage their anxiety. Disorganized kids, high anxiety and high avoidance. So this is really very dangerous because this kid has incredibly high anxiety, so they're not regulating, but they also don't have any capacity to go to the caregiver to manage that. And the reason why is what they found then. So what happened is I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So they started looking at these kids in the 1980s a lot more closely. And they started saying, okay, we need to look at these kids, and we also need to look at their caregivers because there's something happening here that we don't understand. And so Mary Main, who's a professor at Berkeley, she came up with what's called the adult attachment interview. And this is prior to this disorganized classification, because they wanted to find a way to understand what the parents' attachment history was and what the parents' orientation to attachment was, and did that have any effect then on how the children were, their attachment was being expressed. So they started looking specifically at these disorganized kids, and they were doing the adult attachment interview, or the AAI, with the parents. And what they found was at about an 80 to 85% correlation. If you had a child who was presenting as disorganized in a certain situation, you had a parent who had an unresolved history of trauma, either child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, some other kind of traumatic event that they hadn't resolved. Now, the key word here is resolved or unresolved. That it wasn't the traumatic history, it was that the traumatic history was unresolved, meaning the parent hadn't done the difficult work of coming to terms with their own traumatic history. So in one way or another, they were passing on this trauma to their children, whether it was through the parent's maltreatment of the child, or it was in expressing their fear directly or indirectly toward the child. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, I saw a video one time, and it's one of the most startling videos I've ever seen. It's heartbreaking. It was a mother who had been physically abused by her father and was currently in a domestic violence situation. And she was holding her 4-month-old baby girl, and her 4-month-old baby girl was crying. You know, when they get crying so hard, you think, oh, they're never going to stop. That's how she was crying. And the mother was holding her, but the mother had dissociated. So the mother's face was completely blank. She wasn't looking at the baby. She was staring off into space, no expression on her face. You can imagine how terrifying that is for this child. The baby's already dysregulated, from her own experience, and to be confronted with a caregiver who was so unable to deal with that she dissociates. Incredibly frightening experience for a child. Another one is, I just lost my train of thought. I'll give you another example. And I don't really know if this child is disorganized or not, so I want to be careful. There's this one incident I saw. I was late one day to my worship services, and I got there at the point where I couldn't enter into the main area, so I had to wait out in the hall for a few minutes. And I was out in the hall, a man came out with his little boy. The little boy's probably about 2 years old. And the man walked out backwards. So the door pushed open, and the man was walking out backwards. And so he wasn't facing me. He couldn't see I was there. But his little boy, I could see the little boy's face over the dad's shoulder. The boy was facing me. And the dad comes out, and I thought I knew I was going to see the dad brings the crying child out, and he cajoles him and talks to him and gets him calmed down and takes him back in. As soon as the door closed behind the dad grabs the little boy, pushes him out from him. So he's still holding him, but he pushes him out from him and starts yelling at him. What's wrong with you? Why'd you cry like that? You don't cry like that. You're bigger than that. And just really fierce, squeezing the little boy, jerking the little boy, not shaking him, but jerking him. And the little boy's face is just shock and terror. And I watched this for, a few minutes, and it didn't go on for very long. It was very startling. And I don't know what this man's been through. Like I said, this is one incident I saw. I'm making some assumptions here. But my guess is that boy's crying triggered something in him that had him respond in an overwhelmingly angry and frightening way to this little boy. Children who have parents who are frightening to them, so actually abusive, and this, I wouldn't say this is abusive, but it was pretty borderline. They learn that my parent, who's the one I want to go to for safety and for comfort, is actually the one who's scary to me. So what do? And it's what Solomon and George, these two women, call the unresolvable dilemma. How do I solve the dilemma that my caregiver is also the source of threat? The person who's supposed to protect me is the one I'm afraid of. How do I resolve that? And that results in what they call disorganization, which is an attachment system. These kids are attached, but it's a pretty scary attachment. It's a pretty difficult attachment to navigate. And so they engage in behaviors, approach and avoidance, and protection behaviors and dissociative behaviors that they kind of try to be close to the caregiver, but they also try to avoid them. And these kids are the kids we see in foster care. It's estimated that 80% of children in foster care are probably in this category. Now, this is a very important distinction to make from reactive attachment disorder. Reactive attachment disorder occurs in children who haven't had a consistent caregiver in their life. Kids who are disorganized have. Now, that caregiver has been scary, but they've had somebody. So we have to be really careful that we're not conflating these two diagnoses. They're not the same things. And what a lot of folks have called RAD for a long time is probably not that at all. It's probably disorganized attachment. And what we have then is a kid who is terrified. And we have that with the reactive attachment disorder too. But in this case, this is what we're seeing. And this is the vast majority of children that we deal with in our system. So I want to make that distinction, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. Another research then that kind of is paralleling some of the attachment research. Right around the 40s and going into the 70s was some really good research being done on institutionalized children, and they started seeing there was some very strange behaviors in these kids, almost looking like autism in some ways. They didn't know how to interact with people, not just caregivers, but other children. Their behaviors were really inconsistent, really erratic, and they just had some very difficult behaviors. And they actually had a diagnosis that was basically an institutionalized child diagnosis at this time. And this then is going to move us into the actual diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder. But before I get there, I want to talk about two parallel tracks. So this particular research on institutionalized children really started the research that led to the actual diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder. But around the same time, around the late 1960s, 1970s, there's a guy by the name of Robert Daslow, and he's studying autism. And he comes up with what's called the V process. And his theory is, and this is kind of that refrigerator mother stuff, his theory is that children with autism, the reason that they have autism is because they have all this pent-up anger and rage toward their mother. And so he came up with what's called the V process, which was basically a way to bring that rage to the surface and then hold the child, and then the rage would be dissipated, and the child would then not be autistic anymore. And of course, we understand this is absolutely not true. Well, there was a young psychiatrist by the name of Foster Cline who started reading some of Zaslow's work, and for whatever reason became enamored of it. And he started, and I'm not quite sure, this is a little fuzzy for me, even with all the reading I've done. He started applying Zaslow's work to children he was seeing in his practice, and these are children who were in foster care, had been in foster care, been adopted, and he thought they were displaying some of the same behaviors that the kids that Zaslow was studying were displaying. So, and basically, and both Zaslow and Klein really said the core problem was attachment, or what they saw as attachment, which was this ability to love or bond to the caregiver. So he came up with his own version of attachment disorder. And he started saying that, most kids in foster care have attachment disorder. They can't attach, and then he started really moving into some really dangerous territory, which really is not surprising because he started in, I think, dangerous territory, which is really not very scientific. If he started saying things like, Adolf Hitler had reactive attachment disorder, and Jeffrey Dahmer, and Saddam Hussein, and Edgar Allan Poe, which I always think is really interesting. So your kid is either going to become a bloodthirsty dictator or a poet. I don't really know. But he started making all these really, bizarre predictions, and he wrote these books like Kids Without a Conscience and Kids Who Kill, and he took these really very, very, very small minority of children with very severe issues and started claiming that these kids are representative of attachment disorder, and that most kids in foster care and kids being adopted out of the child welfare system and kids being adopted out of institutions are going to grow up and kill people or kill people and their children. And he had these really, horrific stories he told. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some children who have some very serious behavioral issues, but to take a very small subset of children and then apply that to all children in child welfare was very concerning. Unfortunately, his group, which we loosely refer to as the Evergreen Tradition, this group, they were early adopters of the internet. And so they started getting their information out there very, very early on. So this is, back in the early days of the internet, the early 90s when, they had, kittens and flowers and pink backgrounds and music that played, and, these horrible websites that used to have. That a lot of the early websites, this is kind of what they had, and they started putting out all this information. So you had a foster family or an adoptive family who was struggling with their child, and the struggles are real, and I want to be really clear about that. We're not saying the struggles aren't real. The struggles are real. So they started thinking, these people, they understand it because they can describe my kid, so they must understand my kid. They must know what's going on, and everything they say must be accurate. So these folks gained a really strong foothold really early on. And also in the 1980s, another woman associated with this, her name is Elizabeth Randolph, she came up with what's called the RAD Q, and I'm going to flip to that one now. This is what they started saying were the symptoms of. Now, I want to make a little bit of a point. They said, because the diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder was existent at this point, but they said that what they were describing was different than what the reactive attachment disorder diagnosis was saying. Somewhere along the line, and I'm not really sure when, probably somewhere in the 80s, the two diagnoses sort of converged in these people's mind and in most people's mind in the community. So they used to say, no, we're describing attachment disorder, which is different. But then they did co-opt reactive attachment disorder. And most people now, if you do a search for reactive attachment disorder, this is what you're going to come up with first thing. So they have since co-opted that diagnosis, which is really unfortunate because the actual diagnosis has gotten lost, and this stuff is what everybody finds when this stuff is not accurate. Now, a couple of things I want to say about this list. First of all, just visually, look how long and big it is. This is a big net. If you want to capture most kids in foster care or most kids who've been adopted out of the child welfare system, you make as big a net as possible, and you're going to catch a lot of kids. But this goes back to what I said in the very beginning of the webinar, and that is that they've made the basket too big. They've made attachment about too many things that it's not about. And so just the immediate visual is that this is too much. And one of the criticisms of this is that it's conflating a lot of diagnoses as one thing. So some of these are symptoms of ADHD. Some of these are symptoms of conduct disorder. Some of these are symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder. Some of these are of obsessive compulsive disorder. Some of these are fetal alcohol. So there's a lot of different diagnoses out there that they're basically lumping a lot of the symptoms from into one diagnosis, their own diagnosis, and calling it at first attachment disorder and now reactive attachment disorder. Another really big problem with this is that it's incredibly subjective. So this is not, and science needs to be measurable. It needs to be observable. It needs to be as objective as possible. This is incredibly objective. This is very, it's incredibly subjective. This is very much based upon someone's interpretation of a child's behavior. So when we use the words like superficially charming, who they feel they can manipulate, not affection on the parent's terms, problems making eye contact except for when angry or lying, a severe need, lazy, argumentative over silly or insignificant things, trivial issues, demanding, clingy, inappropriate, lacks morals, values, and spiritual faith, lying for no apparent reason, constant chatter, nonsense questions, so many of these, the sneaky attitude of entitlement and self-importance, all of these things are very subjective. And a lot of these are based upon how the parent or the therapist is interpreting the intent behind the child's behavior. And most of this is saying the child has a negative intent. This is a negative child with negative intent, with maladaptive behaviors, who's out to make your life miserable. And what these folks have done is they have set up this almost child against the parent view. And they really played into this. And oftentimes parents come to this, and that's how parents feel, is I feel like I'm at war with my own kid. And these folks say, because you are. And they say that's because your kid is all these things. And so they don't try to help the parent understand that this is a terrified child who is trying to survive in a world that they don't understand. And that a lot of it goes back to the trauma-informed, that the question shouldn't be what's wrong with you, which is what this is, but instead what happened to you. This isn't based in really understanding the child's history or what could be happening at a physiological or emotional level for these kids. It's simply, this is a bad kid. You are right. You're a good parent with a bad kid. We're going to help you basically by punishing the child. And their approach tends to be very punitive. It tends to be very controlling. And this is where the conflation of the attachment system and the dependency system comes in. These folks also tell you things like you have to control everything this kid does. You have to control everything they eat and drink. This child can't move or say, jump without you saying it's okay. And so what they're trying to do is trying to say if you get this kid to be completely dependent upon you, they'll be attached to you. But that's not accurate. You can be dependent upon someone and not attached to them. You can be attached to someone and not dependent upon them. Kids are generally both attached and dependent, but they're not the same things. And these folks have unfortunately conflated those things. Now, if you send to your trainer in your email saying what you learned from this webinar, and if you say the symptoms are RAD or anything on this screen, you will not get credit for this webinar. I had a woman do that the previous webinar. You're kind of missing the point. So, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to say, I really want you to understand this is not accurate. When you come across this stuff online, know that there's no empirical, meaning scientific, observable, objective research that reinforces what these folks have put out there. These folks have made up this list, put it all over the internet, and because it's been out there for 20, 30 years, everybody thinks it's true. But in fact, it's not. And even reputable websites end up with this stuff on there because they don't understand the history. You've got to understand the history. This is not reactive attachment disorder. This is a made-up version of attachment disorder that is basically a made-up diagnosis with a made-up symptom list. So let's talk about what it actually is. So the actual diagnosis was first introduced in 1980, and it's been revised now 4 times. Interestingly, Charles Zena, who's been working on this for probably 30 years, almost from the beginning, he, in the last version, or the most recent version, which came out just earlier this year, is on the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. He said, okay, we've done more and more research on this diagnosis, and we now think that there's not 2 subtypes. We think that the other subtype, which was what used to be called disinhibited, which is where kids do what's called the indiscriminate signaling, meaning they go to strangers, They go to anybody. They don't seem, even if they're attached to their caregiver, they'll go off with some nice lady in the grocery store. That used to be considered a symptom of RAD, and it's no longer considered that. It now has its own category of disinhibited social engagement disorder. So, and part of the reason why is because what they saw is you could have a group of kids, and a lot of their research has been done on post-institutionalized children, so children being adopted out of orphanages, especially Eastern European orphanages, and children adopted out of foster care, especially kids who've had very severe neglect or kids who've had a lot of changes in primary caregivers early on, which is most likely to lead to actual reactive attachment disorder. But what they saw is that certain features of it resolved after these children were adopted, but the disinhibited social engagement didn't resolve. So you could have a kid who's adopted at age 3. Within 6 months to a year, they're exhibiting attachment, an attachment, even a secure attachment to their caregiver, and yet they're still going off with a lady in a grocery store. So they started thinking, why are parts of this being resolved and parts of it not being resolved? And so that's when he started saying, we think it's something else. We don't think it's actually part of RAD. And so they actually took it out and made a completely different diagnosis of that. So what is reactive attachment disorder? Now, right away, visually, you can see a big difference between this one and the one I showed you that came out of the presentation. This is much more discrete. The symptom list is much shorter. It's very specific about going back to what we talked about, that self-security and seeking out the caregiver for safety and regulation. So these then are, they first of all, and this is something that Charles Zena will say, is if you have a kid who's over 5, who comes into foster care, who's 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, you should not be diagnosing them as RAD, because we don't know that these behaviors were there before they were 5. That's one of the criteria, is behaviors have to show up before 5 years of age. So these are kids who rarely or minimally seek comfort when distressed, and they minimally don't respond or minimally respond to comfort when offered to them. And then they have difficulty with responsiveness to everybody. And that's where another big difference is. The other people said, oh, these kids are really good with the school teacher, but they're bad with mom. That's not this. If you have a kid with attachment issues, this kid has attachment issues across the board. It's not just with mom. It's with any potential caregiver, even a temporary one like a teacher. Their aspects, meaning they're positive, their smiles and their laughter and their expressions of delight and joy are very limited. And there are times when you just don't understand why, but they're irritable, sad, or fearful, which don't make any sense. And this, once again, speaks to the trauma-based piece of this. That when you have a child who responds, especially negatively, in a way that doesn't make sense to the current situation, it's a really good clue that their trauma has been triggered. This stuff happens in trauma, so we cannot differentiate a history of trauma from the history of reactive attachment disorder. Not having a primary caregiver to take care of me is incredibly traumatic. And these children, this is trauma. And so we can't separate those two things. Okay, so I'm running out of time because I talk way too much. I'm going to have to kind of hustle. So this one is just to talk about the different camps that are out there. The Evergreen camp, anyone who, wholesale talks about, attachment disorder, reactive attachment disorder, uses that symptom list, it has a really punitive and controlling approach to these kids. Those are folks we call Evergreen. They're still out there. Colorado and Ohio, for some reason, seem to be where they come from. There's some folks in Utah, we still have some practitioners in Utah who are really, really into this, and they haven't given it up yet. They've kind of modified a few things. This really should be a 2-hour webinar. There's some stuff I want to get into that we just don't have time to get into. Then there's another category called attached. Now, this is a Venn diagram. The attachment one used to really be almost completely overlapped with Evergreen, because that's kind of where it came out of. But over the years, due to a variety of different reasons, they've kind of separated to some degree. But this is kind of the clinical professional membership. But I'm still leery of it because they still have some of the residue of the Evergreen stuff in them. And so I still tend to be leery of some of these folks. Then there are what I call the academics. These are the people who have been doing the research for decades and decades on attachment in the labs, in the universities, very empirical, very objective, very humane, and they have really good information about attachment. And then the people I call the translators, who are generally clinicians who take the academic work and translate it into the clinical world. And these guys, this is the circle security people, this is Daniel Siegel. These are the folks who really understand attachment from a scientific point of view and are able to then say, okay, then what do we do? How do we help these kids? And what's really happening here, and how do we help them? Once again, very humane, very empirical. Why does it matter what we call it? And I'm just going to hit this very quickly. When one of the problems with the very prevalent way of looking at RAD, or attachment disorder, is people see that as such a big list. It boundaries how we think about these kids. These kids are thought of as bad, as disordered, as wrong, as serial killers in the making, and that changes how we see them. It changes how we consider them. So what we call something boundaries how we think about it. It creates a way of considering the individual, and it can to some degree become self-fulfilling prophecy. And it also limits our ability to think about how to solve what we might be seeing here. But what are we looking at then? Because I don't want to say that it's not that, so there's no problem. No, y'all know these kids have some issues going on. But one thing we need to think about is that it's probably a lot more complex than just this one behavioral system. Attachment is absolutely part of it. But trauma, not only attachment trauma, but other forms of trauma also. Stephen Porges has a concept called neuroception, which is, once again, the sense of felt security, which is in our bones. And until a kid feels safe, attachment doesn't happen. So kids have to feel safe before we start to see this occurring. We talked about it being adaptive. Grief, people miss this one all the time. People assume because the first caregiver wasn't great, these kids don't grieve them. Guess what? They do. And we miss it. And we miss that these kids are desperate. They miss their mom so bad they can't breathe. And we think because she was a drug-using prostitute, they don't miss her. They weren't even attached to her. We're wrong. They were. We talked about this organization already. Our own history. We all bring an attachment history to the table. And how our attachment history interacts with our kids' attachment history absolutely has an effect. This is not to blame the parent. This is just simply understanding that I'm in the room, and what my stuff is going to interact with my kids' stuff, and that's going to make a difference, either for better or for worse. And it's simply recognizing I'm in the room, not blaming, not shaming. Physiological issues, kids who aren't sleeping well, kids who have fetal alcohol, kids who have other kinds of medical conditions, kids who have issues with protein, not having enough protein in their diet. There's a lot of things that actually can lead to behavioral issues that are actually more physiological than anything else. And then, of course, developmental delays. So you have a child who's 7 who's developmentally much younger. And, for instance, the crazy lying that they call a symptom. You have a kid who's 7 who lies about something that's evidently not true. But you know what? That's normal for a 4-year-old to do. And so this kid may be developmentally much younger and doing something that's completely developmentally normal for where they are developmentally, but maybe not chronologically. So what are some things we can do then? And this is where we really should have an hour just to talk about these things. Pay attention. Pay attention to cues. Know your kid. Know your child as an individual, not as a diagnosis, but as an individual. Who are they? How do they react to certain situations? What's really going on for them? Our ability to read our kids' cues is the core of secure attachment. Life books, helping them to understand their own life story, is absolutely critical to secure attachment. Cues and miscues. If you come to circle of security, we talk about this, that a lot of our kids miscue. This goes back to the kid who wants to be close to their caregiver, but they act like they don't want to be close to them, so the caregiver will stay close to them. That's a miscue. The kid saying, I don't want to be close to you, that's a miscue. The kid is saying the opposite of how they actually feel. Your ability to recognize when it's a miscue and to respond to what the kid actually needs and maybe not what they're signaling they need is a really critical piece for this. Emotional regulation, allowing emotion, saying to them, I know you're mad, honey. It's normal for you to be mad. It's not okay for you to hit. Let's do this instead. Letting them have the emotion and providing boundaries around the emotion is a critical piece. We also do another class called emotional coaching. If you want to come to that, we talk about that more. Making sure their physical needs are met. Kids who aren't getting enough food, sleep, physical activity, sunshine, our kids are going to be struggling. So making sure that their physical needs are being met is really critical. Persistent and parallel. Don't over engage with kids who are scared of you at first. Being there is critical, but being overly there, intrusive, may not be good. And so you may need to kind of pull back a little bit and kind of hang out in the same room with the kid without overly engaging with the kid. And so just that idea of being persistent. So I'm always there, but I'm parallel. So I'm not asking for you for more than you can give back to me. And I'm not trying to overwhelm you with my presence at first is a really critical thing. Setting realistic expectations for yourself and for the kids, knowing there's no such thing as a perfect parent, just a good enough parent, but there's no such thing as a perfect kid either, just a good enough kid. Take care of yourself. Your ability to regulate your child is directly linked to your regulation. So if you're not well regulated, you can't regulate your kid. So that means you need to get enough sleep. You need to get your emotional needs met. You need to have people you can talk to so that you can be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind for your child. You need someone who's bigger, stronger, and wise and kind for you. And then repair. One of my all-time favorite concepts. You're going to mess up, and you're going to mess up again, and you're going to mess up again. But when you keep coming back and you keep trying to fix it, and you keep trying to say to the kids, you know what, I messed that up. I didn't get what you were saying. I didn't get what you needed. But I get it now. Let's fix this. Let's repair this. That piece turns out to be more important for secure attachment than getting it right the first time. Getting it right the second time or the third or the fourth time is actually more important than getting it right the first time. Because what these kids learn then is that relationships last even when they're messy, even when they're overwhelming, even when things go wrong, relationships last and we can come back together and figure it out. And that is a critical piece of attachment. This is actually, if anybody wants a copy of this, I'll be happy to send it to them. You also can, link to the webinar again so that you can pull up this information if you need it. But these are some good resources. NCTSN, I recommend this all the time to everybody. It's put out by the National Institute of Health. They are fabulous. They have so much information to understanding trauma with our kids and taking a trauma-informed approach. Bruce Perry's work is childtrauma.org. Stephen Porges, whose work I've become lately enamored with, is really this idea that attachment is not in our brains, it's in our bodies. And we need to stop thinking about thinking so much. And we need to start thinking of what's happening at a visceral or bodily level to really understand attachment. And some great books, The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Daniel Siegel and Tricia Hartzell, Attachment and Common Sense in Beetles. This is a book that actually comes out of England that's really good, very humane, has some really great ways to understand attachment, especially disorganized attachment. And then one of the all-time best books for helping kids with grief is Helping Children Cope with Separation and Loss by Claudia Jewett-Jarrett. And we don't have a ton of time to talk about this, but I love Mumford and Sons. And this song, I was listening to it one day, and I was thinking about our kids, and I was thinking about you guys, and I was thinking about the foster and adoptive parents that I've met who are so good at this, who are so good at seeing their child not as damaged goods, but as a kid who's had a lot of hard things happen to them and has come from a hard place, but there's no fault in them. They're powerful and they're beautiful and they're strong, and that the parent is able to see this beauty even through the cracks and able to fully engage with them. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you and how much I appreciate your willingness to let your own lives be broken to some degree, or even that your own lives already have been broken, but you're willing to let that brokenness be touched by these kids. And that together in our difficulty, together in our brokenness, together in our healing, we come back together and we create this new relationship that isn't perfect, and yet it's beautiful. And there's the lyrics from the song. So I'd recommend listening to this if you can. It's called The Ghost That We Knew by Mumford and Sons. Think about our kids. Think about their fear. Think about their hearts, and think about them as compassionately as I know you can, and I know you do. And then once again, this is something you're not going to be able to write down or anything, but you can always come back to this through the archive, or like I said, I'm happy to send this to you. But the reason I want to end with references is just to let you know I'm not making this stuff up, that there's a lot of excellent research that really gives us some important, vital, and humane information about attachment. We don't have to listen to the stuff that leads us to treat children in inhumane ways. Listen to the stuff that leads you to to compassion. Listen to the stuff that leads you to an open heart toward these children. And that's where how kids will heal, how we will heal, how our families will heal. So thank you for being here today. Like I said, I'll send this to you. I also have a ton of other information. I can send you, more articles than you ever want, or book suggestions than you ever want. So thank you once again. 3 things to your regional trainer for credit.